So another major era in the post-World War II period in the United States that would come directly out of all the things that we've been talking about, especially events of World War II and the changes that occurred afterwards, is the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. So we're talking about the Civil Rights Movement. Civil rights in general are essentially your rights as protected by the government, your rights as a person living in a society, right? But specifically when we're talking about U.S. history and we capitalize civil rights movement, we're talking about this specific period of time from approximately 1954 through the end of the 1960s, civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement grows from other movements like the Double V campaign during World War II, like anti-lynching campaigns, like people resisting and organizing against segregation laws in their own areas, in their own personal lives. But we really get a full movement when a variety of different efforts in different places across the United States all kind of start to galvanize together, and it becomes a major wave. So when we're talking about the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, we're talking about key issues that were focused upon by several different organizations, several different organizing efforts across the U.S., specifically focusing on the mistreatment of African Americans through specific things that we've learned about, wanting to push for desegregation. That means ending segregation, the racial separation of people, black and white, right, which we also call Jim Crow laws that started after slavery ended. They were focusing on voting rights, ending those restrictions that started after Reconstruction ended in terms of, poll taxes, literacy tests, allowing kind of threats and terrorism leading up to elections, things that in effect, even no matter what the law said, right, the 15th Amendment saying you have the right to vote regardless of your race, the 19th Amendment saying you have the right to vote regardless of your gender. Despite what the law actually said, the reality on the ground is black men and women were not able to even register in the places where most black men and women lived, right? So pushing against those voting restrictions. Another major issue of the civil rights movement, addressing the racist violence that was so pervasive, especially in the South, but as we mentioned, with the growth of the Klan outside of the South, which was endemic to pretty much anywhere a black community existed, right? In the South, you have lynching and the Klan. Outside of the South, you have the Klan, but you also have, as I mentioned in the last lecture, and as you should have seen, when, people are trying to exercise their freedom of buying housing and living in different areas, facing the racist violence of those trying to drive them out of neighborhoods, right? So facing this racist violence regularly. And then because of the great migrations, the two great migrations of black people out of the South, you did not just have black communities in the South as you traditionally had, right? So you have now black folks in urban areas as well. And so while the South, the U.S. South is going to be the focus of the civil rights movement, it's going to spread to cities where you're going to have kind of this recognition that there are broader issues that affect black people regardless of where they're living in the United States because of these kind of historic systemic issues which affect their, black people's access to jobs, their access to quality education, their disproportionate experiences of poverty, right? And then in those urban areas, especially the issues of housing, the issues of police brutality as being kind of very systemic and endemic to kind of police training and kind of these are the way this is the way we do things, right? So addressing those issues that were disproportionately affecting black people. Now, the foundation for a lot of the civil rights movement's arguments was that, hey, almost 100 years ago during Reconstruction, amendments were added to the Constitution that 100 years later still have not fully been applied for African Americans, right? And so the civil rights movement drew upon two Reconstruction amendments especially. And it's not just the civil rights movement. A lot of other groups, a lot of other movements especially have harkened back to the 14th Amendment. Even up till today, many cases in the Supreme Court revolve around the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment is what it guarantees you equal protection under the law. As a U.S. citizen, regardless of everything else, you have the right for the government to protect you the same as they protect anybody else, right? Is that no group should have the different experience of not getting equal protection under the law. And so many folks in the civil rights movement were building the argument that segregation is not providing equal protection. Discrimination in job hiring is not providing equal protection. Disproportionate mistreatment by the police is not providing equal protection. Lack of access to housing is not providing equal protection. Right? Segregation, lynching, the violence, clearly violation of the 14th Amendment. And then for voter rights, the 15th Amendment, right? You were not supposed to be barred from voting based on your race, whether that be through direct laws or through the refusal to stop things that are obstacles to voting, right? Allowing Klan members to do what they did before elections, allowing intimidation, allowing people's voter registration applications to be thrown away, right? This needed to be addressed, along with the things that were illegal, like poll taxes, literacy tests, right? Leading up to the civil rights movement, you kind of began to have this shift, especially coming out of World War II, where you just, you had the U.S. talking about fighting fascism, fighting the injustices of the Nazi regime and of Mussolini and of the Japanese Empire, fighting for, we need to have a secure democracy around the world. And then now in the Cold War era, talking about the evils of communist Russia. Nobody has freedom there. People don't have freedom. People can't, exercise their vote. There's not a real democracy. And yet you have people in the United States saying, well, that's exactly how we've been living. That's how we live. What makes the U.S. so different in regards to how it treats its own citizens when we're talking about citizens that are African American compared to what you're saying is so evil about these other places in the world? So there begins to have this shift towards a more democratic mindset, kind of overall, right? The open denial of people's rights is not going to stand so much longer. So you have in the 1950s, as the civil rights movement begins, President Eisenhower in office. And as I mentioned, Eisenhower was soft on racism, right? He was one of those people who says, let's not talk about it, let's just kind of hope for the best. If we talk about it more, it's going to, quote unquote, raise tempers and increase prejudice. So and we still hear this today, people have this notion that if you talk about race, it'll promote more racism. Well, that's the same as thinking like, if you talk about your broken arm, it'll make it worse. Well, if there's a problem, if there's an injury, if there's something that's wrong, not addressing it in order to heal it is not going to work, right? Sweeping things under the rug doesn't make things go away. It just leaves a big lump in the rug that people can now trip on, right? So this idea that like not talking about it because it's too controversial of an issue and it stirs up too many feelings, is actually the opposite of how you heal things, right? If you have a problem, a trauma, whatever it is, it needs to be, addressed in order for it to be healed. But because the folks that are in charge and who are benefiting from the system as it works are not experiencing the injury, right? It's beneficial for white people not to talk about race because then they're not losing anything by not talking about it. But there are folks who are saying, well, if we just keep things the way they are, it's not really living out what we're saying the U.S. is supposed to be, what our ideals are. You have this kind of unintentional movement, though, towards kind of more democratic rulings in the Supreme Court when President Eisenhower, chooses California Governor Earl Warren to be the Supreme Court Chief Justice. So if you don't already know, whoever's president, whoever's in office as president, one thing they have the power to do is choose Supreme Court judges if there is an opening on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court always has 9 judges, and the Supreme Court rules on people's rights. When people sue the U.S. government for violation of their rights, or sues a state government, or sues someone about your rights, it's the Supreme Court is where that goes eventually, right? State Supreme Court or U.S. Supreme Court, if it's a valid case. So there's always 9 judges on the Supreme Court. Judges can serve for life, unless, as long as there's good behavior, unless a judge, gets removed for bad behavior, retires, or dies while they're on the court. They stay in office. If that happens, whoever's president nominates their replacement. And then that nomination, I think, so-and-so would be good for the Supreme Court. I nominate them. Then the Congress has to approve, or the Senate has to approve that nomination. So Eisenhower, there was a space on the Supreme Court. Eisenhower was president. He chose California Governor Earl Warren. Well, he chose Warren because he thought he was kind of a middle-of-the-road politician like him. He was politically kind of, fence-sitting, not extreme either way. However, when he actually got on the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice is the leader of the court, actually led for some pretty liberal rulings, progressive rulings while on the Supreme Court. So, for example, in 1962, the Supreme Court ruled on Engel versus Vitale, which outlawed in-school prayer, right? On the argument of so we're supposed to have freedom of religion and separation of church and state in federally funded, taxpayer-funded schools. You should not be having the imposition of one religion, right? You can say in-school prayer. Well, what's wrong with people praying? Well, if you are a Christian, and what if they were imposing Muslim prayers? What if they were imposing, Hindu prayers? Well, you have to look at it from the perspective of what has been normalized. Well, a lot of Christian things have been normalized in our society. The Supreme Court is ruling, well, just because it's normal doesn't mean that it doesn't violate the law. We have freedom of religion under the First Amendment, which means the government should not impose or encourage any specific religion, right? So that ended in-school prayer, and that was a thing before, morning prayers in school. In 1963, Gideon versus Wainwright, this is what ruled that your inability to pay for a lawyer should not stop you from having the right to your representation. The Sixth Amendment in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights says that you have the right to an attorney. Well, of course, the right to an attorney in our kind of capitalist society is dependent on whether you have the ability to pay for those services, right? But if you're not able to pay for those services, you have a real serious barrier to getting justice, right? Most people don't know how to represent themselves in court. Most people don't know how the law works or how procedures in court work. So if you are being charged with a crime and you are at risk of losing one of your natural rights, life, liberty, or property, this ruling said that you should be entitled to have bare minimum basic legal representation and guidance. This is where you begin to have public defenders, taxpayer-funded lawyers that can be assigned to you if you can't afford a lawyer, right? This is one of the rights that are read to you, right? In the event that you cannot afford one will be appointed to you, right? A lawyer is a person who studies the law, and most of us don't. And so having that kind of is more about leveling the playing field between someone who can afford to pay a lawyer $1,000 an hour, right? Or $500 an hour, or whatever the fee is, versus someone who can't. That shouldn't be based, your ability to seek justice should not be based on your income or your money. And that's related to the 1966 ruling, Miranda versus Arizona, which says that you have the right to be informed of your rights if you're placed under arrest. And these are your Miranda rights that you get read after you are, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say or do can be held against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. In the event that you cannot afford one will be provided for you. We get that term Miranda rights from this case, Miranda versus Arizona. We even use it as a verb now, like Mirandize him, or she's been Mirandized, right? We're talking about reading your Miranda rights, and it comes from this man, Ernesto Miranda, who had this case against the state of Arizona. Ultimately, in the case, he wasn't, he stated that he was not made aware of his right to remain silent. or to have a lawyer. And so he claims that he was forced into a confession, thinking that he had to say what the police were asking of him, and stayed being interrogated without a lawyer for hours. Right? And he claimed he didn't know. The Supreme Court says this is not okay, again, because most people don't know their rights, right? We don't want to trick people. It shouldn't be the goal to trick people into self-criminalizing, and criminalizing themselves, making themselves look guilty. Like the goal should be to get to the truth and to have people's rights protected, because the power of the government and the power of law enforcement and the legal system is much greater than the individual. And so there needs to be some balance there to protect you from the power of the government to take away your life, your freedom, your property. All right. So when we get into the civil rights movement, you kind of already have this movement kind of going towards this understanding of like what we fought World War II for, officially was for greater democracy, greater freedoms. We're in the Cold War. The rhetoric of what we're fighting for is for individual freedoms, right? Civil rights. And then you have the experience of African Americans leading up to this, decades of organizing, that then culminates in these major organizations that almost seemingly in tandem or, in relation to each other and kind of all at once, really kind of start pushing forward for, hey, actually fulfill the rights that you say we have. So we can go back to the NAACP. NAACP stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Colored in the United States meant what we now say is Black or African American, right? It didn't mean all people of color. Colored is a term that was applied to Black people, and it was on segregation signs, right? White only, colored only. And so that was the term that was used normally at that time. Today, it is not acceptable calling people colored because it has that history of being used to like oppress Black people, like, go to the colored section, right? So words are just words, they're just sounds we make. It's the meaning we put to them. And that word has that meaning of this history. Which is why this organization, founded all the way back in 1909, doing kinds of work like against lynching and so on, now goes by the NAACP, NAACP. But they were around since the turn of the century when, the Klan was coming back, when people were fleeing from the South. But they were still around during the Civil Rights Movement, and they become a major organization, especially hiring lawyers to defend people that were getting arrested, especially hiring lawyers to push cases to the Supreme Court to defend Black people's rights. You also have the founding of CORE during World War II, right? In the Double V campaign of people pushing for, hey, we're fighting against fascism, we're fighting against these rights violations in the world, we should be fighting for them here in the United States as well. So the Congress of Racial Equality was founded in Chicago in 1942. They also will be a major organization during the Civil Rights Movement. And then two organizations were founded during the Civil Rights Movement. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference started officially in 1957, and it's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be one of the major organizers of the SCLC, that would do a lot of organizing in the Black churches of the South for a lot of the actions of the Civil Rights Movement. Boycotts and protests and voter registration drives would be done primarily through the Black church and the SCLC. And then you have a lot of students, college students, high school students, and even elementary school students that are going to get involved in organizing and being people showing up for this movement. And it's going to be primarily Black students, but you're going to have a lot of branching out into white students and non-Black students also getting involved in the civil rights movement through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They would do carry out a lot of the actions that we associate with the civil rights movement. Two major cases that happened in 1954 that really spark a nationwide movement, in large part because of television and magazines as well, spreading the news. One is the Emmett Till case. You'll see in a video assignment that you'll have, but it's essentially the case of this 13-year-old boy or 14-year-old boy, Emmett Till, who is from Chicago, and that's him with his mother, Mamie Till. His father had died in World War II as a soldier, and so Mamie Till was raising her son, Emmett, in Chicago, and she was like the first Black woman to be hired, I believe, as a secretary for the city of Chicago. She went on to become a teacher. She sent her son to Mississippi to stay with her uncle for the summer, along with his cousins. Kind of like people send their kids back home so they can know what, the home culture was like. So she sends him back home to spend the summer on her uncle's farm. He's a sharecropper. And so Emmett Till goes to stay with his cousins and his uncle. While there, coming from the North, not really aware of the rules, the unwritten rules of how Black people are supposed to behave in the South, he gets accused of speaking the wrong way, or perhaps, depending on whose story, whistling at a white woman in a store. This was the story. And he was lynched in the South, 14 years old. Brutally, he was kidnapped from his uncle's house in the middle of the night, brutally tortured and beaten, and then shot and thrown in the river. Well, what his mother did was demand to get his body back up to Chicago. She had an open casket funeral so people could see what happened to her son. And the photographs of his body were published in like Jet magazine, and then in newspapers across the United States, and then around the world, to call attention to what Black people were living through in the South. A few months after that, you had Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, get arrested for sitting in the white section of the bus. Rosa Parks got arrested, and not just because, I just wanted to sit down, I'm tired from work, and I don't care if you arrest me. Rosa Parks had been a respected community leader for many years. She had led anti-segregation movements and been a part of anti-segregation movements, and her being arrested was actually part of this kind of like a movement of people who were resisting the law because you feel that the law is morally wrong. Well, when she got arrested because she was this notable figure in the community, it pulled people together of like, this is wrong, it's time for us to stand up and do something about it. And so the people of Montgomery boycotted the bus system. They refused to ride the buses, and they were the majority of the ridership. And they're saying, we're the ones paying our money to this bus system for them to mistreat us. We're not going to ride the bus anymore. This is where we first see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He becomes the leader he's called in as he's Dr. Martin Luther King, right? So he holds his PhD, or his doctorate rather, in theology, right? In the study of religion. He is a minister. He gets called into as this new young leader. I think he was 25 or 26 to lead this bus boycott. And of course, the boycott is just, we're going to organize and not spend our money on the bus. But by Southern norms, that enraged a lot of white Southerners, that Black people were stepping out of their place in not accepting the treatment that white Southerners believed they deserved in terms of segregation. So they got, a lot of death threats. They got a lot of harassment. Martin Luther King Jr., not in the bus boycott, but, in similar actions afterwards, would be arrested multiple times for leading a nonviolent movement. So he became the co-founder and president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And for all of his efforts in leading people, it was always through the philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is when you purposefully break the law because you're making an action to show that the law is unethical or immoral or violating people's rights. And the law is morally wrong. You violating the law is morally right. Right? So like, for example, like the idea of like running away from slavery as a resistance. You're breaking the law, but you're saying the law shouldn't exist, right? So purposefully breaking the law, purposefully going into white-only spaces, purposefully sitting in the wrong section of the bus, purposefully demanding service where you're not allowed to have service, right? So he got arrested many times. One of those times in 1963, he was put in Birmingham jail. And in Birmingham jail, he wrote a very famous speech called Letter from Birmingham Jail. I know a lot of people look at his I Have a Dream speech, but he has so many other better writings because he was a thinker. He was a deep thinker who not only was opposed to segregation, he was opposed to U.S. imperialism. He was opposed to the prison system. He was opposed to at that time, the beginnings of the war in Vietnam, and wrote about that and spoke about that. So Letter from Birmingham Jail is a really great read. That same year, you had the March on Washington, which is where he gave that I Have a Dream speech, but many people don't realize the March on Washington was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, right? And so he also was critiqued the inequalities of capitalism and racial capitalism, where you have the intersection of kind of an economic system with, racial inequality and how that plays out in people's lives in America. He, of course, was assassinated in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, on the balcony of the hotel where he and his group were staying, in Memphis at that time, the sanitation workers, right, the people who work in, the trash pickup, they were on strike. The majority of sanitation workers in Memphis were African American, and they were being paid unfairly, right, and they were being denied certain benefits, and so they were on strike. And so he was there in Memphis to speak on behalf of the sanitation workers union for their rights. And while he was standing on the balcony of this hotel, he was assassinated. And there's a lot of controversy around who assassinated him. On record, it's a man, a poor white man from Memphis who had ties to the Ku Klux Klan. But Martin Luther King Jr. was also heavily targeted and harassed by the FBI in all the time that he was a leader. And so even some ideas that people have of what Martin Luther King Jr. was like today is so skewed from the reality. He was like one of the most hated men in the United States during this time. When they would do polls across the United States of what do you think of Martin Luther King Jr.? He had overwhelming negative reviews from especially white Americans, right? Responses. And so today people think like, oh, he was, this beloved leader. No, he was not. Beloved among his group that he was leading, right? And people who agreed that segregation was wrong, but for the majority of Americans, they're like, he's just a troublemaker. He's a criminal. He's trying to incite people into violence, and he's, stirring the pot and all this stuff. So very negative stuff. And like I said, he was hounded by the FBI, and he and his family were heavily harassed by the FBI. And this is not anything other than declassified FBI files. We know that the FBI were on him, tapped his phone at home, everything. But we only know it after the fact, and people then rewrite that history if they don't know the facts. A contemporary of Martin Luther King Jr. that's also mentioned with him often is Malcolm X. Malcolm X, unlike Martin Luther King Jr., who was based in the South and worked in Southern Black communities, especially through the Christian church, Malcolm X was from the North, right? He was from the city, and he was a member of the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam are what we also know as Black Muslims, right? And so it is African Americans who ascribe to Islam, but through a very specifically African American or Black lens, right? And so it's very much about Black power, Black people empowering themselves, and it's about Black nationalism, right? Not depending on developing your own community and your own institutions apart from the white power structure, so that you're not at the mercy of the white power structure. And he initially was in opposition to Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, saying, why are you begging for your God-given rights, right? Why are you asking people who have a legacy of slavery and maintaining a system that continuously denies you your humanity, why are you asking them for your rights? Instead, you should be living your rights and defending your rights. So he was very much like, forget the nonviolence. If they're coming at you with a gun, then you're going to come back at them with a gun. You're not going to sacrifice yourself, to plead or beg for rights, right? And so he also was from an urban setting, looking at kind of Black issues that were not the Southern Black issues necessarily, but urban Northern Black issues of police brutality, of job discrimination, of housing discrimination, focusing on those issues much more. At the end of Malcolm X's life, he actually went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and he wrote about how that changed him, in the sense that going to Mecca and seeing people of the same faith of all different colors from different parts of the world broadened his experience, looking at, man, how much the United States has warped people's idea of how different people can get along. And he kind of, and then at the same time, Martin Luther King Jr. Later on, seeing nonviolence continuously being met with vicious violence, actually became more radical. So they kind of actually ended up meeting closer to the middle at the end of both of their lives. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, likely from somebody from within the Nation of Islam itself, because of internal struggles about Malcolm X and what his message was and his own changes within himself. A major figure from the civil rights movement that often doesn't get covered, because it's usually, Martin and Malcolm that are like the major ones, and then Rosa Parks. There are so many amazing people who did so much good work locally and in specific areas that they get overlooked. And Fannie Lou Hamer is one of these major figures. And I guess in the past few years, she's been talked about a lot more. But in terms of like the history books and stuff, it's still kind of Martin, Malcolm, and Rosa Parks, right, as the major leaders. But Fannie Lou Hamer, I just want to do like a little intro about her. She was a voting rights activist who was trying to register to vote, was arrested and severely beaten by police to the point where she lost sight in one of her eyes. And she just was like from a rural area, a mother who wanted to register to vote. And being so severely beaten by the police completely radicalized her, where she got completely involved in local organizing in Mississippi. She became a student nonviolent, a SNCC leader, leading voter registration campaigns, but also focusing really on issues that she felt affected Black women and Black families, right? And talking about the economic aspect of racial inequality, right? That there needs to be more resources for poor Black families, and pushing for things that were often seen as women's issues that were often overlooked in the movement, but things like daycare services, and trying to explain, look, this is a pivotal thing. If there's not childcare services, that, limits people severely, and especially women who in poor communities need to be a breadwinner in the household. What do you expect to happen to the children, right? And especially for poor children, and especially for poor Black children, it leaves them so much more vulnerable to so many negative things happening to them. So advocating for things that people didn't think of as civil rights issues, but daycare services. She worked to form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to oppose the only political party that represented the state of Mississippi was the Democratic Party, and they were aligned with the Ku Klux Klan. And she was like, Mississippi has a huge Black population. In many counties, it's like 80% Black people or more, and yet they're being represented by Klan members. So she worked with others to create this new Democratic Party to try to challenge this party that was aligned with the Ku Klux Klan. She was part of a group of people who sued the state of Mississippi over unfair elections. So using multiple strategies to try to counter this inequality, but really working locally, like working with just people in the community, but getting all the way up to sitting in the state legislature and, being at congressional hearings. And just, she had like a middle school education, I believe, right? And talked like plain people and was talking about people's issues, but she knew what she was talking about and bringing her experience and those of people like her into it. Then we look at the issue of school segregation, which is going to be the first issue to fall in the civil rights movement. If we go back to 1898, if you recall, Plessy versus Ferguson was the case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, in which the Supreme Court ruled that segregation is legal back in 1898 after Reconstruction ended. That separation is legal as long as the separate facilities are equal. You can separate bathrooms and schools as long as the bathrooms for the two races are equal. That was like the argument. Then you're not denying anyone their rights. Well, the reality, the lived experience was the facilities were very, very rarely ever equal, if they even existed for Black people. You had many instances where it was just white only, right? But people began to make the case, and especially through the NAACP and their lawyers that they hired, began to put together a case saying that segregation is inherently unequal because you have a system that has been dominated and created for the white population. And then by telling the black population that you cannot come into this place because of your race, that itself, just saying that you can't come to a place because of your race, even if there is a place where you can go separate, but saying you cannot come here because you are black is unconstitutional. And it's not the same as, well, what about the black only places? The black only places are not created by black people. They are created by white people, and they're forcing black people to go into them. So if you think about like on a bus, there's the black section in the back and the white only section in the front. Well, white people could sit in the black only section or the black section. If seats ran out in the front of the bus for white people, they could sit in the black section, and black people were expected to vacate the seats. So you have separate, but it's not equal. So in 1954, NAACP's lawyers put together a case on behalf of a 9-year-old girl named Linda Brown to sue the Board of Education. I believe, is it in Topeka, Kansas? But the Board of Education that was upholding segregation. And they made the argument that by segregating students, you are already doing damage to black students, saying that they are not allowed here. And from children being raised from the time they can understand anything, being told that you are not allowed to come here because of the color of your skin is a damage that treats people unequally. And part of that was using something called the Clark doll experiments, where you had a husband and wife team, Dr. Clark and Dr. Clark, they were psychologists, who went around interviewing black children who went to segregated schools throughout the South. And, little kids, 6, 7 years old. And what they did to try to put together the case of the damage of segregation was they used baby dolls, toy baby dolls, a black one and a white one. And they would ask the kids simple questions about the dolls. They would put the dolls on the table and ask them, well, which doll is the pretty doll? And which doll do you like better? And which doll is the smart doll? And which doll is the one you want? And then which doll do you look like? Right? And gathering this information of the damage that's done by kind of privileging whiteness through segregation, among other things, right? It's absorbed by children from such a young age, and it affects the way that children believe in themselves or see themselves. This eventually led to the Supreme Court ruling on behalf of Brown in Brown versus the Board of Education, and that ruling said that school segregation is unconstitutional. It violates the rights of those children, which then began the ball rolling on desegregating schools. It didn't happen all at once. It actually took more than 15 years to get through most schools in the United States to force them to desegregate, because just because the law changes doesn't mean that people's actions actually change. And you had a lot of resistance. You had white parents organizing against desegregation, creating what were called white citizens councils. And they could often be looked at as middle-class clans, right? So the Ku Klux Klan was often relegated to those are those rural people, those are those rednecks. Now you have people in suburban areas who are organizing, and they call themselves this is the White Citizens Council of, Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, or this is the White Citizens Council of Birmingham, Alabama, or whatever it is, right? They're creating these councils to protest black students coming to the school. You had children being brought into these protests, to say, we don't want black students at our school, we want to keep our school white only. And so the slow process of desegregation in many different cities led to a lot of mistreatment of kids. You had a handful of kids being thrown into white schools and then having to bear the brunt of the mistreatment from their classmates, from their classmates' parents, from the school teachers, from the school administrators. This famous picture of Elizabeth Eckford, a 9th grader, coming into the school and having grown adults scream at her just for trying to go into the school. It's a very iconic photo there. 1960, it's not that long ago. The famous case of Ruby Bridges. You may have read the story of Ruby Bridges. It's a children's book as well, a very popular children's book. This little child here, going to school when New Orleans was forced to desegregate their schools. They had to send in, military police and government officials to escort her into the school. That whole first year she went to school, all white parents kept their kids home from school as a protest. The first year of her schooling, she had to go to school by herself. This is Ruby Bridges today. It's not ancient history. She was a child in 1960, and she's an older adult today. Right, this is what we would say, like the boomer generation. This has included them too, right? So this is not ancient history. There's many people who are alive and well today who lived through segregation and the process of desegregation. Then the movement went on from public schools to public universities and colleges that traditionally denied black applicants. And so in 1962, James Meredith, who was a military veteran, became the first black student at Ole Miss, which is the University of Mississippi. He faced, protests and death threats and regular threats against his safety trying to attend the school. We had to have military police and government officials, where he had to, deal with harassment from other students, right? Like this is a photograph of an effigy that was put up, "Go back to Africa where you belong." This is James Meredith today. Again, not that long ago. He's a senior citizen today, but that's what he lived through. And you had broader desegregation movements, then moving into desegregating lunch counters, buses, waiting rooms. You had sit-ins at all these places, all these different universities. You had black and white students together who were, protesting. They would sit together in restaurants, and then you'd have crowds of people like throwing food at them, punching them, yelling at them, and then the police coming and arresting them. So you have this set of major issues, major events that you're going to see in a short little documentary that you're going to be assigned, where you're going to see the protests, the desegregation, violence. You're going to see these major cases of people being murdered during the civil rights movement for protesting for civil rights. All right, that takes us to writing assignment number 13. There's going to be 8 questions in total in the 2 parts of this week's lectures. This is the first part on the civil rights movement. You're going to read a PDF called Army Veteran Robert Williams Argues and answer these 2 questions about that reading.